and enjoy, and it also creates more value for a place. But we also know clearly that most of our zoning laws and regulations tend to force the stuff on the right. So a lot of what I tend to focus on and talk about is the unintended consequences of regulations that get us to the stuff on the right and how to push back and not have that be your place. And also, we try to synthesize a lot of great information from other people. This isn't all our stuff. We're not creating this from scratch. I know Chuck Marone's been out to talk to you all at Build Maine in the past, but just as a reminder, you know, when you look at the value of a place, of a downtown, a reasonably blighted one-story downtown, like Chuck's town on the left of Brainerd, Minnesota, has a phenomenal more value from a tax value per acre than the Walmart down the street. Again, how we measure stuff matters, and looking at the value of small-scale incremental development that is very parking light creates a much more prosperous return for a town than the Walmart. And these numbers do include sales tax too, so it's not just the property taxes we're talking about when we describe value. And a central theme for the first half of my talk is going to be this big difference between people and cars. You know, people spend money, cars don't. Cars are exceedingly expensive to store, and they take up a lot of space, making it really hard to have a prosperous downtown if your primary focus and goal is storing vehicles. So a lot of this is coming down to how do you strike the proper balance for vehicle storage so you can maximize the place for people, which generates income, rent, property taxes, and also an enjoyable environment to spend with our fellow human beings. And another great talk, and just as a pause, this presentation will be online for download for our website. What I've tried to do with all our presentations is there's a lot of supplemental information. Ed McMahon has a great TED Talk. There's a link to it on this page that you can go to. And he really talks about the importance of place, tying together historic preservation and economic development. And a couple key points are as small towns and mid-sized towns are trying to figure out how to succeed, what that means, how to attract people and talent and business. You know, his point is if you can't differentiate your town from somewhere else, you're not going to win in this place arms race that we're seeing. You know, people want to go to unique, special places. You've got to figure out what makes your town unique, you know, which will tie to its history and what you have. The Chili's and Applebee's do not make your town unique, right? There's no reason to go visit for that. I'm sorry if you like those. Not my thing. And then we also want to talk about, you know, well, gosh, great, main streets, we love them. They're fun to walk down. Why are all the buildings empty? What are we trying to do there? So again, part of what we try to focus, the message we try to spread are helpful tips and hacks to actually put these buildings and places back into productive service. Because, I mean, these buildings aren't that big. They can't be that complicated, it would seem, until you try to do one. So we like to say small-scale developments like a game of Frogger. On a good day, you make it all the way across, hopping on logs, not alligators. But alligators abound, and so we're going to talk about how to identify some of those. And part of the focus of this talk is it's really twofold. If you're an architect or small developer, these are things to be aware of to help make your project successful. And if you're on the municipal side, these are things that you should be thinking about at the city level that cause a lot of pain and suffering and cause projects to fail. So if you want projects to succeed, these are things to think about to see what you can change from a regulatory standpoint in your town to promote success. The first part of the talk, I'm going to talk about site issues. Then I'll transition to very building-specific issues afterwards. But, you know, one of the things we see all across the Southeast and in a lot in Midwest and America where we work is that so many towns in the 60s, 70s, and 80s adopted suburban-style zoning regulations for their towns without any clear understanding of how these zoning regulations were completely inappropriate for the traditional building style of our place. This is amazingly true for Main Streets. And the single biggest pain and suffering point for the suburban zoning is parking requirements. You know, Kara Wilbur warned me not to talk too much about parking because we got Donald Shoup talking later. I couldn't resist. I will talk about parking a little bit as a setup for him. And then one of the things we have in Atlanta, and varies by jurisdiction, is Atlanta has one of the most robust stormwater policies in the country, except that they put the cost of that on private developments, right? So we require parking there and robust stormwater. That requires a ton of money. I'm going to talk about that relationship and how to avoid those costs as well. And when we talk about place, I'm an architect first, so I tend to look at the sidewalks and the buildings as a primary, but street design is a critical component of all this. That is not my area of expertise, but I do want to have a few quick points on that just to be aware. And I know, I think Patrick's going to be talking about street design and things after me, so I'll leave a lot of that stuff to him, who's much more knowledgeable in that field. And just as a reminder for those of you that don't read about zoning laws on a daily basis, zoning came out, a court case, Euclid, Ohio, took it to the Supreme Court for the right to legally separate uses, and this was in the 1920s. In that, back then, the goal was to protect the virtuous, holy, single-family housing from the evils of commercial and industrial development. So in the 20s, we're talking about steel mills, hog rendering plants, all kinds of nasty stuff. Well, in this day and age, the new century that, from the last presenter, the commercial uses that are thriving in cities tend to be service-based, and we're not rendering fat other than we're, maybe gourmet butter, but it's not a hog slaughtering plant anymore. And the separation of uses creates tremendous challenges for creating walkable environments. And so understanding that if you want to have valuable sites, you need to minimize the space dedicated for cars. That means you need to maximize the potential to walk between places. Proximity really matters. And understanding that zoning forces separation, it is a major killer of value in your place. And one of the other things we like to talk about with zoning is something that people don't really realize that often, is that zoning from the 70s and 80s made a lot of existing stuff non-conforming or illegal. This is called grandfathering, right? They typically in most zoning ordinances, if you've got a shop in a residential neighborhood that was there before zoning, it's grandfathered, you're allowed to keep it, but you can't do stuff to it. One of the things we like to point out to city officials is if you've got some vibrant places of your town that are illegal by zoning, it's not the place that's wrong, it's the zoning that's wrong. Look to think about the grandfathering and make that a permitted use. And I also like to talk to folks about how do you lose your grandfather status. A lot of jurisdictions say that if you change the use, you've got to start back over, you lose your nonconformity, you can't translate to something else. In Atlanta, we take a lot of things from one thing to another. If this was a church taken to a Montessori school, we had to start from scratch from conformance. That's a long, painful process. Again, understand how grandfathering is lost. If you like the use, think about ways to make it permittable. The other thing we see is when you do additions to buildings, that's another great way to trigger a loss of your grandfathering. And oftentimes, the grandfathering is a lot less of a big deal on the building code side. We typically see the most pain and suffering coming back to parking with the change of use. So the parking requirements tie directly to grandfathering in terms of how things can be better or not. And if you limit what can happen to a building because it's grandfathered, you're really limiting the economic potential of a building or site to contribute to your place. So we like to say that if you're going to try to do small-scale development without grandfathering, where you have to fall into all these other compliance requirements, it's like going into the Thunderdome. It is a complex, hard, expensive process. There's a reason there's not a lot of small developers out there, and that developers tend to be at a certain scale, because you need to have the wherewithal and brain power and financial resources to power through this stuff. And all these taken together can kill a project in the blink of an eye. And again, one of the biggest first primary things we love to hammer on is parking requirements. Most of our downtowns were built long before zoning regulations were put in place. Most of these buildings will fill the majority of their site. They may have a small spit of land off an alley if they're lucky, based on how your downtown was built, but you don't have any parking. So if you're requiring parking for a downtown Main Street building, what you're saying is that you either have to tear down half your building to put a parking lot in, or buy the lot next door to tear it down to put a parking lot in, or you're going to have to go through some kind of variance or legal entitlement process to ask for forgiveness for not having a conforming situation. None of these things create value for your place. And again, also, we have written several articles about this in depth. I could talk about parking for hours. I'm going to keep it short. And so the right thing to do, if you've got parking requirements in your town, is simply to get rid of them, at least in your walkable areas, your downtowns. Now, I get that a lot of you, particularly on the municipal side, have to run for election, and parking is a really third-rail topic that involves pitchforks and rotten tomatoes. So, if you're not bold enough to risk your political career in eliminating parking requirements, I've got a series of Tim half steps for you, right? So, if you're not manly enough or womanly enough for that, let's talk about this stuff. All right, so this is a collection of how to hack your parking requirements from great ideas we've gathered from around the country, and I'll talk through these a little bit of time. The first New Orleans does is that they allow you to maintain the grandfathered parking rights of your use when you change a use. I'll try to speak in a non-planner zoning attorney language. What that means is that if you've got a retail shop that should have had 20 parking spaces and it doesn't have any, you have rights to those 20 spaces you obviously don't need. And if you wanted to convert that retail shop to a restaurant and it was supposed to have 25 spaces, New Orleans only makes you find the difference, the 5 spaces in some fashion. In Atlanta, we have a really asinine zoning ordinance that says if you go from retail to restaurant, you've got to find all 25 spaces. One of the main reasons we tear everything down in our city. The next thing we do on the positive side in Atlanta is we allow for time of day sharing administratively. This means that you can have multiple uses in your building and try to maximize value of the parking space so that you can do office use 9 to 5, restaurants from 5 to 10, and depending on how you blend your residential, you've got some flexibility there. The comment on this is that Atlanta does kind of like a strict interpretationist approach where either something's open or closed, and you either need all your parking or you don't need any of it. What this means in a lot of the warehouse conversions we do to loft office, we can do nighttime only restaurants, but we can't have the restaurant open to serve lunch in the day, which is a big bummer. ULI has a pretty helpful shared parking resource guide that you can buy. It gives you great metrics to look at time of day demand for different uses, understanding that some uses need like 80% of the parking at this point, 40% at that point, and you can present a much more nuanced shared parking demand study to your city. Big point on the municipal side, entitle that, allow for that, and again, all of these things are intended to be little quiet text amendments that you could sneak into your zoning ordinance while nobody's looking. Those are much less risky than a whole zoning overhaul to touch the third rail. The other thing we do in some municipalities, you're allowed to count the on-street parking spaces next to your site to meet your totals. This is a big deal. My friend Ivy Vans here, we were talking about her place in New Hampshire. Again, Atlanta, we don't have snow, we don't clear streets, and if it does snow, we shut the whole town down. Y'all don't get that option. Understand, though, that on-street parking is a tremendously valuable resource to your city. You should leverage it and use it to the fullest extent. If your town bans on-street parking for snow plowing, which prohibits you from using the parking as a way to deal with these issues during the winter, really think about that policy. When you start running the math of value of a parking place versus on street versus the cost of the maybe pervious paving or else do it off-site, the costs get tremendous quickly. I don't run your budgets, but just be aware of the trade-offs that you're making if you're prohibiting on-street parking to snowplow. I'm not saying don't snowplow, I'm saying get creative with your solutions. If you have a, if you have a municipal lot, allow people to count shared spaces if they're in reasonable proximity to it, and don't really worry if you overcount the spaces or oversubscribe the spaces. This again, it's about reducing parking requirements any way you can. The public won't be looking at how you count those things. Another great thing from Dallas is that Dallas, Texas allows you to become exempt from one parking space for every 3 bike parking spaces you provide. This is another cheap, easy way to promote infrastructure for bicycles on the site level and reduce your parking counts there. Atlanta, we're working on a rewrite that will look at eliminating parking requirements for buildings built before a certain date. I've been pushing the city to set that date as late as possible to give us as much flexibility as possible. In Atlanta, we're looking at the 60s. In other towns, it may be the 20s or 30s, whatever is appropriate for your place. The rationale is that these places, these buildings and sites were built when parking wasn't required, and it is an unfair mandate to put that requirement on them now due to the fact that you have to tear them down. The other thing, which is a new thing we're toying with in our office, is We're following closely the impacts of Uber and Lyft in our city and other cities around the country, and we know autonomous vehicles are coming. Whenever we do a variance to ask for parking relief, we will show how we've designed in a drop-off loading spot, particularly for restaurants, for Uber and Lyft, because we're seeing more and more people take that to get to dinner, to have the second bottle of wine, and then safely get home in the car share. This is a phenomenal way to reduce this. And just a quick anecdote, the LA Times had an article over a year and a half ago now where they were tracking revenues from parking valets versus restaurants. A year and a half ago, parking valets had their revenues down 30 to 40%. Restaurants had their revenues up 10 to 15% because people were taking Uber and Lyft, getting a second bottle of wine at dinner, and taking that home, dramatically showing the reduced need for on-site parking in a parking-intense city, in a parking-intense use. Another thing that we try to point out with some of our neighborhood centers is that it's not just the building you're looking for as an asset to redevelop. We're really looking for sites that have some existing asphalt as well. That is a tremendous resource in our city because we don't get penalized from a stormwater standpoint if there's existing asphalt, as opposed to having to put new paving in or expand the footprint of a building. So anything we can do to mitigate site costs allows us to deal with putting money back into the building and making better buildings. And the other thing, and this varies greatly by climate and place, a lot of cities really hate gravel as a parking surface. If you're doing a lane renovation and there's an existing gravel lot, requiring that lot to be paved can put tremendous amount of cost burden in a project. Now I get snow, I get ice, I get other issues, but in a climate-specific point, I love to challenge municipalities. How big a deal is it if cars are parking on gravel, and particularly if it's intermittent parking, not everyday use? And again, I truly hate on-site stormwater requirements because we deal with it so much in Atlanta. I love the talk about bioswales and the connection with nature, but the cost of this stuff is amazingly tremendous. The best thing I love to challenge cities with is in Atlanta, a lot of our parks are actually in low-lying, not well-buildable land. Perfect places for collective solutions for stormwater that looking at options for paying fees in lieu of providing stormwater on site is something I'd love to see our city get to. Anything you can do to allow for collective solutions as opposed to putting an individual mandate on a property will allow for a more efficient solution on a community level, just like on-street parking is more efficient than the per lot on-site reserve spaces, and or like a community parking deck is another option as well. And again, stormwater vaults don't pay taxes, they don't create revenue, they just are a cost that have to be maintained in perpetuity. And I'm borrowing both these slides from my friend Scott Doyen, who's going to be talking later. Don't tell him, it's fine. But Scott wrote a phenomenal article on Placemakers, his firm's blog, about streets and place design. And it really talks about some great points about, do you treat your street as a link to get from point to point, or are you really trying to celebrate as a place to be? And if it's a linkage to get from different places, the road is going to be wider. It's about traffic movement. It's not a place you're going to want to hang out at. A downtown where you want to be, you need to move the cars exceedingly slowly and provide as much space as possible for people in your sidewalks and public realm. So this is the same diagram on the left and right of the streets where the building line is the same, but you can see how the space is dedicated to streets versus sidewalks. It's a great article, and I don't think Scott's going to be talking about this much. Track it down, it's worth a read. And he did a phenomenal reinterpretation of a graphic, I think it's from Jan Geller's group in Copenhagen, where our bodies are physically designed to withstand being hit by an object traveling 20 miles an hour. You know, maybe an evolutionary defense, like how fast can an elephant run or whatever and knock us over and still live. 90% of people will survive a pedestrian crash with a car if the car is going 20 miles an hour or less. This is why we feel safe when cars are moving slowly and we're on the sidewalk. When cars are moving 40 miles an hour and we get hit, only 10% of people will survive that crash as a pedestrian. That's why we get freaked out when cars are moving fast down our street. If you want your downtown to feel like a place that you want to be, to walk to from store to store, you've got to control the speeds, you've got to keep the lanes narrow and have buffers and space for people. Yet another reason that on-street parking comes in to help provide a physical protection barrier between pedestrians and the cars themselves. All right, so now we're going to shift to some building issues. I talked about some of this yesterday, so I'm going to go kind of lightly over that. And I'm also going to talk about ADA, because this is another issue we deal with all the time in Atlanta, and I want to try to provide some clarity and guidance on that. We also have a really amazing long presentation Elizabeth Ward in our office put together that I'm linking to. That's a long presentation in itself. It's more that be aware that that's a great resource to look at. I'm not going to go into the ADA components fully here. Again, same buildings, trying to renovate them. Why is it so hard on the building side? The biggest issue we see is that, let me go back, in these buildings, time and time again, we see folks needing to get people living downtown to keep it activated, you know, as a 24-hour community and not be dead at 5 p.m. The most logical place to put residences on the second, third, and fourth floors of these buildings, I mean, that's just, it's a natural response. The challenge is with our current building codes, if you have a residential use in a building, it has to be sprinklered, and the entire building has to be sprinklered except in a few instances, which I'll talk about. And the slide on the left is a commercial sprinkler system. The slide on the right is a residential sprinkler system. It will typically cost $50,000 to $60,000 in most jurisdictions to simply get the sprinkler to your building, to get that riser, that big set of pipes and valves into your building, and then you run the sprinklers at whatever local cost that is, maybe $1 to $2 a square foot. That's a tremendous cost burden on a very small project. If you're trying to renovate a 2,000 or 3,000 or 4,000 square foot building, the per square foot cost is tremendous. The bigger projects, these are much easier costs to bear, and I'm not here to argue against sprinklers from an effectiveness standpoint. They're phenomenal to help provide for safe buildings, but the building codes take are heavily influenced by the sprinkler industry in their amendments in writing. We take the stand that if the building code does not require a sprinkler, the sprinkler industry has tried to get a sprinkler there and gotten pushback from the code officials. So we take some solace in that. Again, sprinklers are good, they're tremendously expensive. The other point is that residential sprinkler systems are phenomenally more cost effective to install and do a great job. You're just not allowed to use them for commercial uses, except in a few rare exceptions, which we'll talk about. So typically small development, you got to put a NFPA 13 sprinkler in, you're done, you can walk home, the building's not going to get renovated, not going to happen. Again, hopping over alligators, finding ways to actually make projects happen in a positive sense and get some residential involved. And again, we're not talking about a 5-story, 100,000 square foot mill building. We're talking about the typical liner thing on a typical Main Street from a scale standpoint. And another big issue that wraps into this is what code does your local jurisdiction use? I know Maine has adopted the existing building code. You guys can give yourselves a great pat on the back for that. It's a tremendous tool. However, adopting it without training is a problem. I was really encouraged to see there's a training class yesterday to help give people feedback on how to use this. The training is necessary for developers, for architects, and for your building plan reviewers. It's not as cut and dry as a standard building code, so plan reviewers can get kind of twitchy with this. You need to be aware of this on the city side. I'm going to give some examples of how this stuff plays out. If you don't have residential in your building and it's small, there's a high likelihood you don't need a sprinkler at all per a building code standpoint. So that just makes it really simple. This is your brain damage meter to know how hard it's going to be. If you're not changing your occupancy, you're also usually in a pretty safe harbor place. Or if your new occupancy is less hazardous than your existing occupancy, that's also a pretty safe place to be. The International Building Code says that, but it doesn't tell you what occupancies are more or less hazardous. The existing building code actually gives you some very specific references as to how to know what is more or less hazardous. These are what code officials like to see. It takes the burden of guessing off of them. So again, if you download this presentation, we'll reference the code sections as a cheat sheet for you to give to your architect or to the building plan reviewer to say, look, you know, table 10.01.2.5, here's where this stuff is. We're not making it up. That's how you get it to your designers and get it approved. There's another option where you're allowed to do a fire barrier in existing buildings only, where if you want to put residential on the second floor, you can do a 2-hour fire rating to separate that or reduce fire spread to the residential and only sprinkle the residential. This is a way to not have to sprinkler the commercial. The challenge with that is that in a lot of these great old buildings, we have tin ceilings or other decorative elements that are really challenging to contend with and provide a fire barrier. One of the historic consultants yesterday said they finally, after years of working with the Maine Fire Marshal, were able to get approval to use intumescent paint to paint those ceilings as the fire barrier. Intumescent paint is a special chemical product. When it's exposed to heat, it foams up and provides a fire separation barrier. It's tremendously expensive. It's a very effective product, and it may be much more cost effective than taking an entire decorative ceiling down and trying to put it back up. So this is a path. We did not want to rely on this, though, as our only solution for getting residential in your downtown. This is the code sections on where the 2-hour separation comes from. This is an example of a non-intumescent paint fire-rated detail that you can share with your architects if they need it. But there's another way to do this, and this other way to do this to get residential in a smaller building without commercial sprinklers is this really cool thing called live work. This was introduced in, I think, 2009. The history of it turns out it came out of the Congress for New Urbanism really pushing on the building codes and International Code Council to put this in. This is kind of tricky even for architects. Live work is a residential use. From a building code standpoint, that means it's considered residential. That means you can use a residential sprinkler system for it. That means that if you have live work units on the ground floor and residential units upstairs, your entire building is residential. You can use a residential sprinkler system through your entire building, getting residential in a building with some commercial stuff activating the ground floor without the expense of a commercial sprinkler system. Now, the other thing I do for architects is that everything I just told you is building code land over here. Zoning land over here is a different place, and they speak a different language. In zoning land, what happens is that live work use will probably be considered commercial from a parking count or other standpoint, however your square footage FAR limitations or however your jurisdiction does it. Understand that zoning and building codes should be addressed in your architectural plans as two separate sheets because they're addressing two very separate issues in very different languages. You know, Spanish and Portuguese, they're not fully different, but they're different. So you can tell the zoning guys, I've got a commercial use as part of my live work, and you can tell the building guys, it's all residential. That is fully legitimate, but you have to understand how to speak building and how to speak zoning. Different languages. Different sheets of paper in your drawing sets. Don't try to save on trees and put them on one page. Bad things will happen. You'll be reprinting the set time and again trying to explain it. So again, graphically, if you've got live work on the ground floor and residential above, you've got a residential building from a building code standpoint. Now, there are some limitations, as always with codes with live work. The first thing is that a live work unit is limited to 3,000 square feet. That is a limitation on the size of a unit, not on the size of the floor plate of your building. Just remember that. You can have a building bigger than 3,000 square feet. You can still do live work with 2 units on the ground floor. The other thing is that there's a limitation of how much non-residential space you can have. That is up no more than 50% of the overall unit size. The non-residential component has to be on the ground floor or main floor of the live work unit. We take that to mean the ground floor of the building, just in terms of our interpretation, or probably the technical term level of occupant discharge where it connects with the street. And you can not have more than 5 non-residential workers or employees allowed to occupy the non-residential unit at any one time. They do not talk about customers, only employees in these limitations. I will point out that other than those limitations, there's not much to talk about what kind of use the work component can be in terms of your place. We tend to see this as phenomenal for light business and mercantile. Again, offices for accountants, lawyers, maybe not doctor, but designers, and maybe some kind of light retail. Coffee shop with cooking might really start to push the limits. That's going to be up to the local code interpretation. Tread carefully if you're trying to push a heavier use. And this is an example of a typical floor plan of a live work building where the live work's in front, the entire back half we're dedicating as living space. If thoughtfully designed, your kitchen for your residential component could also function as a highly functional break space for the workspace in the front. We show an ADA bathrooms focused on the work. We show a second bathroom with an ADA shower focused on the live and back. If properly designed, you can also from an ADA standpoint, you'll also be conforming with Fair Housing Act if this is a new building. The question was asked yesterday about fair housing, which is really important on residential design, except that it does not apply to buildings built before 1992. So if you're fixing up a cool old building in your downtown to put residential in, odds are probably you're not going to be affected by Fair Housing Act from a code restriction standpoint. So if you want residential downtown, think about live work, and then the corollary added at the end is that also think about horizontal mixed use. What I was just talking about in vertical mixed use, one building, different uses stacked above each other. Horizontal mixed use means you'll take one building for residential, the building next door will be commercial. Separate buildings, the code compliance gets phenomenally easier. And I say this because if you've got zoning ordinances that mandates vertical mixed use, as a lot of form-based codes do, you're creating a lot of barriers and challenges to redevelopment if you don't know this stuff. So understand how the goal of vertical mixed use is great. It can be easier achieved with, or the same effects with horizontal mixed use in your place as well. Most other options for small development, your head will explode. Either go big or go home. Don't do it. And then I want to talk for a few minutes about why we love the existing building code and how this can be a tool to help renovate these buildings. There are more flexibilities with compliance with renovations. It is critical, though, to have good staff that understands how this code works. There's not a lot of plan reviewers out there that come with this training. You're probably going to have to provide it to them. And if you're an architect trying to use this, that means you may need to help find a way to get your town to train your plan reviewers on the private sector side. One thing that we love to stress to people is that if you've got a designated historic building, the existing building code provides phenomenal flexibility for code compliance. We have taken several buildings to get historically certified in the past solely for the purpose of more flexibility with renovating them under the building codes with no desire to actually get the historic tax credits at the end of the day. So I applaud her that Lewiston is pursuing a National Register District for their downtown. I applaud that effort. That makes it phenomenally easier for a building to be considered contributing from a National Register standpoint. That's a really easy box to check than to use the historic path for the existing building code. The picture down below is an example of an old church rectory in New Orleans, two-story, that we converted to a middle school. You're not supposed to be able to do that unless you sprinkler a building and have education on the second floor. Because we're historic, we were provided a much more flexible path with the fire marshal to work through egress and a range of other issues. They were happy to have us do fast-acting smoke alarms and fire detectors and doors and automatic holds to provide a safe environment for the kids in lieu of the fire sprinklers. And again, this is a small building. The footprint's maybe 2,500 square feet. Scale matters in how you approach these things for this infill stuff. And a couple of highlights from the existing building code. When you're historic, and what's really helpful to understand is that the existing building code takes an approach that historic buildings are hard to renovate, and that the single best thing you can do to provide a safe environment for your occupants is to provide a sprinkler. And the trade-off that they give you is that they say, if you sprinkler your building, we're going to give you relief in a vast amount of other areas that we expect would be very difficult for you to deal with in a historic building. These things include, for 1 hour fire assemblies, if you have existing plaster lath, they will accept that as appropriate for 1 hour assemblies where they're required. A lot of traditional historic buildings will have transoms and glazing from old doors and windows to common hallways. The existing building code says if you provide fire sprinklers on both sides of the glass, you can leave the glass in place even if the wall is supposed to be rated. This is a great way to maintain historic fabric, to maintain the historic integrity of a building. It gives you much more flexibility with maintaining existing stairways, handrails, and guardrails. You do not have to bring this fully up to code if you're sprinklered, and there's more room on egress for that as well. And then lastly, it says generally if you have to have a 1 hour fire separation in your sprinkler, you don't have to provide those separations at all. Again, you got that tin ceiling or some of these other components. It limits what you have to do to upgrade that because you provided a sprinkler. And so one of the last things I want to talk about is ADA. We've been dealing with this a lot over the years, and we're actually helping the city of Atlanta craft a policy for ADA in existing buildings. We've got a long presentation on our website that you can download and for free review it. It's very expansive. There's a lot about the ADA to understand. I'm not going to go fully in depth in that today, but I want to hit some high points to make sure people can understand how ADA applies with existing buildings today. The first thing is that ADA went into effect in 1992, so a vast majority of our building stock was built before that. We see time and again people turn away from existing buildings because they cannot solve the ADA access issues. The first thing people need to understand with ADA is that it says that you should upgrade your building to the maximum extent feasible to provide access and compliance. They go very specifically into depth as to what maximum extent feasible is, and it also says that if you're not planning to renovate your building, the question comes in, what is my obligation? What am I supposed to do? What is recommended is that you would get with an architect or a design professional to do an assessment of your existing building, to simply make a list, to have a memo of the stuff that should be fixed to provide ADA compliance. And that things that could be easily accomplished without too much difficulty or expense. So identify the barriers, create a plan. This is not just an architectural plan, but like, hey, I'll get to this stuff down the road as I fix this other stuff up. And it gives you a very specific list of how to prioritize the stuff you're doing. This is literally a memo you put in your file for, to be safe as a building owner. Understand that ADA, and this is the scary part, is not enforced by anyone. It's enforced by the Department of Justice, but it's typically enforced through lawsuits and tort issues brought by local people suing you. This memo is an important situation. It's not saying you're not going to get sued, but it's what the Department of Justice recommends you do to be safe. They have their own checklist from the DOJ that you can use to cover yourself with these issues. Now, the next thing is that, let's say you are going to renovate, what do we have to do to our building? You do not have to bring an existing building fully up to ADA standards. Anything you do new from an alteration or addition standpoint has to fully meet ADA. The question always comes in, well, I'm renovating the top floor, what do I got to do with the rest of the building? The ADA is highly specific and says that you are only responsible for spending up to 20% of the budget of the applicable cost of your alteration towards ADA upgrades. Now, we have a lot of slides on this, but what I will say is your applicable costs are not your total project budget. They are very clear that the costs are only to specific upgrades to the primary function area. That's a special code word for the main space of a building, the offices, the ballroom, or whatever. Things like electrical, lighting, HVAC, roof repairs, window repairs, all those are excluded from that budget. We typically see that particularly if we're just doing a shell renovation, that 90% of our budget does not apply. So our upgrade requirements are really a fraction of our total budget. This isn't to say that we don't do ADA upgrades beyond that, and that maybe you should or shouldn't. This is saying specifically what the ADA requires of you. And we feel this is really important information because we see ADA access upgrades as often as a go, no-go decision for old buildings because people don't understand their obligations and responsibilities or the limits to that. There's also, I'm going to go back to one more. The ADA guide, we incorporate some other stuff, but they have a small business owner's guide, and this is a really helpful guide because it takes the expectation that you're probably, as a small business, going to have a lot of challenges upgrading your building, and so they try to give you some things to do at a minimum to make access better. We do work in New Orleans where the vast majority of the city was built long before ADA, and the humble doorbell for a commercial business is a go-to recommendation for small businesses. Have an action plan for when somebody with disabilities comes to your place, how are you going to get them in? That may be a fully non-compliant ADA ramp that just helps get over a step or two that you put out for them, the doorbell to notify, and a training plan for staff to help provide access. I would have that stuff written down in that same file with your list of barrier removal, but that is what DOJ and the ADA is telling you to be doing. They're not saying you necessarily have to tear the whole building down and start over. We had I was at CNU in Seattle this year, and a building official for a small town in Georgia was saying that his city manager wanted to tear the entire downtown down because it didn't meet ADA and start over. That is not how this is supposed to work. And then one of the things, too, that was discussed, and Misty was talking about yesterday, is that there's a lot of bridge funding and finance incentives to renovate downtown in Lewiston and other places. The ADA has a tax credit and a tax deduction for small businesses. We've got the link on here that you can, again, download this from our website. You can get a tax credit for up to $5,000. If you spend up to $10,000, I think $250 of ADA renovations, and a tax deduction up to $15,000 for the remainder. It's a little complicated. You spend $20,000 on a renovation, there's tax credits available. The other thing to understand is that there are a boatload of expenses in a building renovation that counts to ADA upgrades. Anything bathroom related to make them accessible, including the walls and the plumbing, counts. Putting an elevator in fully counts. Fixing up the front entry fully counts. It's not just the ramp on the outside to get you into the building or a lift. There's a lot of interior improvements that also fall in the basket that you can get tax credits for. And again, if you're going to do an incremental approach as a small business, you can chip away at this year after year, and each year meet this obligation and use these credits. And then lastly, you know, I helped teach with John Anderson, Jim Kuman at the Incremental Development Alliance. I know they're up for a boot camp the past couple years up here. I want to share that if you do use social media and you're on Facebook, the Small Developer / Builders group, we're up to almost 4,000 members right now. It is a phenomenal, happy place for small developers and builders and architects to discuss and get real-time feedback to challenges they're facing. John Anderson puts a tremendous amount of time moderating. I do as much as I can as well. And more kind of graduates from these boot camps are sharing their knowledge and experience. The goal is to help you be successful as a small developer, or if you're a city official trying to encourage this, we want to give meaningful feedback to help you make good decisions and good choices and get you successful projects. And we just ask that you continue to pay that forward to folks you cross paths with in the future. And with that, thank you guys for letting me speak. I'm happy to take questions if there are any. And there is a mic in the middle.
I was just going to say there's a mic so we can hear the questions and then hear the answers. Do we have questions for Eric? I've got like 7 pages of notes I just took, so thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
PowerPoint. Yeah. Just out of curiosity, all your rules regarding ADA come from the law.
Yes.
How do those relate to case law? I mean, are the judges following that, or are they making businesses or nonprofits do improvements that they shouldn't necessarily have to?
So this is a challenge, right? And this is to say that not every law judge understands ADA. What do you do? And we look at this as like, you can go fully compliant with your building. That's a totally reasonable choice. We look at places where we see a lot of buildings just left vacant and blighted, and we see this as a choice between vacant and blight and repurposing. We don't see this as a choice to, hey, how little can I do to use my building and make a buck. This is about blight removal and getting things in that way. It's a lot easier, honestly, when you're the architect developer taking your own risks. It's a lot harder as an architect to explain these risks to owners, but we have to be try to be as fully transparent with our owners, say this is the law, this is how it's going to go, you may be at risk, it's your decision on how you choose to move forward, but here's the education, it's your decision. You know, we're there with you to support you whichever way you want to go. Some architects don't take that risk. What we found generally is so much of life, and this matters about expectations. We have seen time and again when architects and developers do new construction buildings, there's an expectation of perfection from ADA compliance and every other point of compliance from a building. We tend to work with really beaten up, blighted buildings. Our level of expectation is just less shitty. Right? When the expectation is less shitty, there's a lot of ground for like, well, it was really shitty before, totally less shitty now. That's not to say there's not challenges and there won't be more challenges later, but we find that less shitty realm a really safe space to be in, as opposed to, you know, perfect gods from on high that gets everything right every step of the way every time. So.
Great. Any other questions? I think you were asking about the PowerPoint. Eric will have that. We'll get that out to everybody.
Yeah, and our website is kronbergwall.com. There's a blog on there. We've got a full ADA presentation, and just kind of on the ADA, state of Georgia has an amazingly wonderful state employee, Stephen Jones, his job is to help provide ADA guidance for businesses and occupants of the state of Georgia. We work with him tremendously on project after project to make sure we're complying with ADA in the proper fashion within these old buildings. He worked with us on this presentation, back and forth comments to make sure that the wording is carefully right on each slide. So we feel really comfortable sharing this as the thing for you to put forth because of his assistance with it.
Great. Thank you so much, Eric. Let's have another round of applause for Eric.